And we have with us a Belarusian journalist and analyst Andrei Yeliseyev, who is in Minsk currently. So, Andrei, good to hear from you. I know you are following closely not what just happening in Minsk, but around the country. So what are the major things? I think our audience followed the protest, but really what we have to know up to this hour.
Good evening. Indeed, I'm in Minsk now, and as far as you know, yesterday the protest action in Minsk took place with about 5,000 protesters, which was brutally dispersed. And today at noon in Minsk and other cities, people came to streets again, about 1,000 people in total, and again they were largely detained by the authorities. So as we see, in response to growing social protests, the Belarusian authorities started mass arrests, as they did in the aftermath of the 2010 presidential election, but this time most of people detained later freed without administrative arrests.
But do we know, so if you can compare the level or the way how police reacted during the last protest and this one, you know, do we know about the other people who are still in custody? So, and what we expect to happen next?
Right, the protests have taken place for about 5 weeks already. So, despite most of people who were detained yesterday were later released, hundreds of people who were detained before yesterday are in custody, and tomorrow the courts will take place and review the administrative cases of those who were detained yesterday. So far, about more than 200 persons were in custody even before the yesterday mass protest in Minsk. And we also aware of further detentions of people who are considered by the authorities as those who prepared or were in intention to prepare mass riots. So we also talk about those in custody under criminal cases, not only administrative.
Andrei, and what is happening in other cities of Belarus, or do we know that is anything else apart from Minsk?
Right. Importantly, why these protests are important social phenomenon in present-day Belarus, that they indeed spread at the regional level, and many people who joined the opposition rallies in the past weeks have never taken part in similar events before. So we can see that these protests go beyond the traditional opposition electoral base in Belarus. And also, what is important, we can see that people gather through social networks, mainly through Vkontakte, a Russian analog of Facebook. So we can see that first people in the regions now started taken to the streets, and secondly, even though the opposition structures are insolvent and in many cases unable to gather people, people themselves gather through social networks, which is an important phenomenon in today's Belarus.
Andrei, what is also we would like to understand, the previous protests, they do not happen that often in Belarus. They were more political, so there was always clear distinction between the people who are really active as a political activist and the larger society. What is the feeling about this particular protest of, the most of the people, usually those who remain silent, but who is a silent majority?
Right. As far as you know, the actual trigger of these protests was the decree on prevention of so-called social parasitism, and the requirements of the protesters in the first protests were mostly of economic nature. To revoke this decree, and second, against the ineffective economic policies in general. But many people who took on streets also support political requirements to the authorities, and many people call for Lukashenko to resign. So these protests are not merely economic anymore, but they also have a political agenda already.
And Andrei, so what is the reaction of the official Minsk, and in particular of the president of Belarus, Lukashenko? He is usually very tough on protesters. And can you also put it into more geopolitical context? Because this time we know that there were kind of a softening relations with the European Union. There were a bit of a quarrel with the Russian counterpart of Lukashenko, Vladimir Putin. So there was a very interesting moment when there was a hope that Belarus can move a bit more west and get out a bit of the sphere of influence of Russia, to extent which is possible. So how it all can influence on that? Because definitely there would be tough reactions from the Brussels, from Europe. They can't remain indifferent, and how this situation could be played out by different parties in the context of the geopolitics.
So how Lukashenko and the other officials treat the protesters? There's an ongoing campaign in state media, and which discredits the opponents and people who come to streets, and Lukashenko likes using the term fifth column to discredit all opponents who dare to protest. And also in the aftermath of the yesterday protest, there were a number of fake news on authorities' behalf, as far as you know, about an alleged car with weapons which tried to come to Belarus from Ukraine, or when a legitimate patriotic camp was presented as a militant camp, preparing people for mass riots and so on. So we can see that the authorities do their best to first intimidate the people to take the streets, second to discredit the opponents, and third to legitimize any disproportionate measures taken by the authorities in relation to the protesters. And as for the situation in foreign policy, which Belarus finds itself, it is really difficult situation now for Lukashenko and his team. Indeed, as you mentioned, Belarus is trying to continue its dialogue with the West, and now with the mass arrests and repressions, this dialogue will be threatened at all. And so far, Belarus has not found a solution to a complex of problems with Russia. So we can see that both in foreign policy and of course, in domestic politics, Lukashenko finds himself in probably the most difficult situation ever.
Andrei, thanks a lot. That was Andrei Yeliseyev, who is an analyst and journalist talking to us from Minsk. And in order to know more, I encourage you to go to our webpage and read a few analytical articles about the things to know about Belarus protest and the explanation of them. And we'll be back in a second.